So welcome everyone. I think people probably will still jumping in, but we're going to get started because I don't want to keep anyone past the time that I've promised. So thank you for joining me on a little lunchtime conversation about leadership development and 2023. So kind of my take on what I see as the upcoming trends or trends that are already happening in leadership development, and what are some of the ways that we can think about amplifying, optimizing, and growing leadership development in organizations, and obviously with the aim of achieving business success, because it's ultimately for all organizations. The idea with leadership development is to lead into the business functioning, business success, and kind of organizational advancement. So again, thanks for joining me. Here's what you can expect from me today. You just need to jump and let some more people in. Apologies. Oh, and they've disappeared. So we are gonna very briefly look at the current landscape of leadership development very broadly. So what are the key kind of things that are impacting us? And all of you will be very familiar with this, I'm sure. Then we'll look at the 3 keys to better leadership development 2023, which, as advertised, are going to be evaluation, enabling behavioral learning transfer, and personalized leadership development. I'm going to share with you a case study around how that actually can look like in terms of implementing some of the things that I'll be talking about. And of course, in the end, there will be Q&A. And throughout, if you have any sort of questions or any comments or anything to share as practitioners, please do jump in and or in the chat. I think we have chat available, and I'll do my best to try to actually focus my attention across many different sort of places. So that's still some people jumping in. So that's kind of our lay of the land for the next 40 minutes or 50 minutes or so. And also, as a reminder, there are 2 perks that I'm going to share with you today. One is going to be the leadership development checklist. So as you know, you had to sort of register for this event to provide some of your details. What you're going to get back from me as a thank you is a little PDF checklist for going through today, and also some more things that you can actually then start thinking about. What are the development initiatives in your organization, what is happening, and kind of go through it as a way of checking against some of the best practice things that we know work. And the other one, also as advertised, is I'm offering some free leadership development audit sessions for organizations with myself, basically going essentially to get us through the checklist and some more stuff that I have, and working through ways, identifying currently in your organization what are some of the strengths and weaknesses in how you approach leadership development, and hopefully suggesting some ideas how you can take it forward and amplify it as well. So if you want to claim one of the leadership audit sessions, all you need to do is email me anytime, basically after the webinar, and say, I want a session, and I'll just straight away send you also the link for bookings.
What, recently?
Someone is on.
What? No, that's a little job.
Okay. Yep. That. Melanie was giving us a little bit of a soundtrack there. Thanks, Mel. Anyways, okay. So again, if you want to engage me for an audit session, which is completely free, no obligations, no upselling techniques, I promise, you can email me straight away after the webinar or during the webinar, say I want to claim my spot, and then I'll get in touch with you to get it organized in terms of time and location and all of those things. All right, so let's get started. So what is the landscape of leadership development, right? We know that there are some very unsettling stats in the world of leadership development, thanks to a couple of larger kind of consulting reports that came in the last year. or two, it would be mostly 2021 now. We know that only about 14% of organizations believe that they have done an excellent job in training their leaders. About 48% of leaders, 28% of HR professionals believe that they have high quality leaders and the training actually works. 55% of CEOs report that developing future generation is their primary critical concern. That was last year's major finding from the DDI report, which was really interesting. The top concern of the CEOs amongst the pandemic was the development of leaders and succession planning. And 85% of senior executives lack confidence in their own leadership teams' ability and success to successfully navigate through disruptive times. Right. So we know that all of this, or some of it is, of course, caused by the recent sort of 3 years of recent events that we all are living through and continuing to live through. Those of us in WA saw that today another COVID warning has been issued for us. So it's not going anywhere, and it's continuing to really disrupt the work lives pretty much globally. But there are also some other trends that we actually have been seeing in the leadership development for the last decade, if not longer. So we can't fully sort of blame all of this on the pandemic to say, hey, this is the pandemic and all is happening because of the pandemic or some of the other geopolitical sort of tensions and issues that we have experienced in 2022, right? Some of these trends in optimizing and amplifying leadership development has actually been reported, or some of the issues have been reported as late as 10 years ago. And we kind of unfortunately seem to have made a lot of progress, but also not the type of progress and not as much progress as we have hoped in achieving some of that optimization in leadership development kind of more globally, right? And then more locally, of course, we know that we're currently impacted by a very interesting context of both sort of external environment and the demands that environment places on our leaders, that also has to be integrated into the way that we think about leadership development. So we know that there's unprecedented labor mobility happening pretty much all globally, alongside with geopolitical uncertainties, which means that we have shortage of skills, which leads to pressures and workload, which leads to lack of time for development, and which leads into these real strategic risks in succession planning. And what I mean by that is, if you know or you don't know, but you suspect that, a lot of your workforce or a lot of your leaders are going to switch jobs in the next sort of months, then putting them on the high potential bench, putting them in your succession plan presents real strategic risk to the organization, in a sense of like, what is going to happen if all of them leave? And unfortunately, that is becoming the reality for a lot of organizations that I talk to, in terms of a year ago we had a bench of high potential succession candidates, and 12 months later we're left with one or two, or no one, because all of them changed jobs, went somewhere else, or simply are just not interested anymore in being on that bench, right? So that's together creates this really pressurized sort of environment for leadership development. And of course, leaders are also facing a changing workplace. Again, we know that hybrid work is demands on leaders from the hybrid working situation are much different. They're not necessarily higher, but they're different than what leaders are used to in these sort of more face-to-face office-based environments. We are facing by some accounts, the next pandemic is going to be the mental health pandemic and the looming mental health crisis. And again, this is happening globally. And so how do we equip leaders? What do we need to offer leaders to equip them to deal with a lot of these mental health issues that are coming up? And also, we know that employee engagement is I wrote falling, but it's in a free fall. It's going so low that we have never seen it as low, or we as far as we have tracking it. So I think the Gallup's latest estimate for Australia is 17% are engaged, and that's kind of I think it's the lowest number in a decade. And so all of the trends, this winter or summer, depending on where you are, around the quiet quitting and all of that, and quiet firing and hiring and all that, is really illustrative of the kind of the immense pressures that leaders face with engaging employees, that leads to then kind of the loop of, they are switching jobs, which creates labor shortages, which creates more pressure, and so on and so on and so on. So kind of stuck in this very unfortunate type of cycle, right? So all of this means that we need to really start thinking about how are we going to approach leadership development, not necessarily differently, but what are we going to try to optimize and amplify in the way that we are thinking about leadership development. All right, so this is how I like to think about leadership development, and this is the kind of my view as it has been informed by my research and over 10 years of experience in both sort of researching leadership development and also working with organizations globally in practically applying some of these things, right? So there are 5 key components. Usually we tend to focus very heavily on sort of the part which is this program part. So we think about what is the design, what are we actually going to offer, what is the workshop going to look like, how many workshops, what is the content. But that's really is only one important, but only one part of that larger leadership development initiatives. So other things that we need to think about are the needs. What are the actual training needs that we have, needs analysis, in assessments and 360 and all of that falls into that category. We need to think about evaluation. How do we actually show that the training is working? And I know that evaluation is a growing concern among organizations. So I'm going to be sharing some thoughts on that. Do we have systems in place that allow us to make the training sustainable and make sure that the training actually gets sort of into the organization and changes the behaviors of the leaders that participate. And also the really important bit, which is actually where we should start, is the why. So what is the purpose? What is the strategic alignment of whatever leadership development we're doing, right? So how and why are we doing it? And that should be really the starting point. So I'm going to be talking today about a couple of these things, not all of them, but this gives you kind of the overlay of the lens. So first thing first, as I suggested in the description for this event, we're going to start with the evaluation. Now, for some of you, this might seem like it's a little bit backwards, in a sense that it's evaluation kind of usually comes in the end. I wanted to start with evaluation exactly for the reason that usually people think about evaluation in the end, and it's very late to start thinking about evaluation in the very end. Evaluation really should be a foundational principle in designing your leadership development program. So when you're starting to think about leadership development, that's the time to start thinking about evaluation as well. Why? Because that's the only way to ensure that you can actually design the program that is measurable, and evaluation is all about measurement, right? So how do we actually show the results? Now, showing results means that we need to design the programs that are supportive of us collecting that data as part of the program, which means that evaluation is part of the design, right? So you can see the statistic here again from one of those reports is that about 10% of CEOs believe that their leadership development initiatives have a clear business impact. Now, this is not to say that, leadership development doesn't have an impact. I think there's like a really strong narrative out there that suggests, oh, leadership development is not producing any results. We're spending all of this money and there's no outcomes. I really don't subscribe to that sort of doom and gloom type of perspective. I think leadership training, leadership programs have great impact and great results. We're just not very good at actually tracking and measuring those results. And this is where really the evaluation comes in. So what are some of the things that you can think about in terms of evaluation, right? Everyone's familiar, or most people are probably familiar with the Kirkpatrick's model of training evaluation. I know that my students who are here are, because they've seen this. Hopefully some of the other attendees here are as well. We have 4 levels: reactions, learning, behavior, results. I flipped the pyramid. The pyramid is usually the other way around. The reason for why I've flipped it is because kind of to emphasize the importance of each subsequent level as being actually more important to overall evaluation, but also much, much harder and much more time intensive to actually assess or measure. Right? So reactions are typically very easy. It's something like asking your learners, did you like the training in the end of the training? That's not all of it, but that's typically, still fairly simple. So it's just a way of measuring the kind of immediate attitudes and emotional reactions to the training. Learning is still fairly simple. It's just assessment of sort of content knowledge. So how much do you remember from what you have been taught, particularly with more technical aspects of the training? The behavior is where we expect that behavioral change to actually start happening, right? So if we, especially in leadership, ultimately we're trying to train leaders in different behaviors. Are they changing the behaviors when they go back in the workplace? When we're going to talk about this a little bit more also in the behavioral transfer part. And then we have ultimately the results. So is all of this having an impact on our organizational performance or individual performance, team performance, and organizational performance? Now, the results are, of course, the hardest, because that's where we need to think and be quite creative in the way that we can capture this. As a way of example, I was recently working with a government agency who were concerned, well, not concerned, who wanted to develop a better approach to evaluating some of the high potential leadership training they were conducting. And we had to think really hard about the results level because there were no really way of us to use any of those, so-called objective data. So any like performance data, due to all sorts of issues of access and just how compatible and comparable that data is. So we had to come up with ways of thinking about results, as I said, a bit more creatively, and essentially measuring results through a behavioral interview qualitative data approaches that tapped into sort of specific examples of where the leader has changed the way that they approach certain situations that they were trained in approaching, right? So where the observers or employees had some kind of actual feeling for change that the leader was demonstrating or achieving as a result of the training. Now, this sounds really complicated. I'm even kind of losing my track myself, and it is, and it sounds complicated because it is, but it's also means that still, we can measure the results levels even if we don't have some form of performance data that we can tie into that. But we just need to think a bit more creatively around how we can do that. Let me just pause here for a second, because I know that I talk often pretty fast. Just pause and just check that everyone is still here. Anyone has any? Remember that you also have chat. You can pop anything that maybe comes up, questions as they come up. We can always address them later, or there'll be also dedicated Q&A the end. Okay, so far so good. The other things that we need to think about is that Kirkpatrick's level for evaluation, Kirkpatrick's model for evaluation is obviously a very well-known one, but there are other models that are more suited specifically to evaluating leadership development. This is just an example of one. I'm not going to go into too much detail on here, but there are ways to also integrate, so say Kirkpatrick and something else, like this learning outcomes model from fairly recently, I think, published last year, around specifically tapping into kind of the leadership development outcomes, right? So what we typically tend to do is then combine kind of different things to achieve a really optimal level of evaluation that is really useful for the purpose-built, right? Purpose-built evaluation for the program. And remember that oftentimes you actually will already have a lot of data that can be used for evaluation purposes. So often what I see happening is that when people think about evaluation, they think about needing to collect all of this incredible amounts of data. And of course, it's time consuming and it's expensive and it can be quite fiddly to actually come up with the data. But a lot of the times when I work with organizations, I already can see a lot of sort of data lying around, which we can immediately start using and repurposing as part of evaluation efforts. So one of the best examples of this is assessment and the overlap between assessment and evaluation. So if you're doing any data collection such as 360s, using any of the more kind of commercial tools for leadership assessment, anything like that. So you're collecting some form of data on your leaders, whether it's behavioral or performance reviews that are recorded, or even more kind of broader organizational kind of engagement surveys or engagement pulses, which are very popular at the moment. Anything like that is already data that we can use for kind of intertwining with our evaluation efforts. And actually, in a lot of cases, that overlap, between those two circles is going to be much larger than what is pictured here. It's just the way to think about data and how it can be repurposed and reused for evaluation. Because the reality is all of our organizations have all of these data lying around essentially and being completely unused, and oftentimes we can get a lot of value out of it without needing to go and start collecting more and more data, which, as I said, is time consuming and expensive and so on and so forth. All right. So that was the evaluation. The second thing that I wanted to touch on, which I've already touched on, is thinking about design for behavioral transfer. So what that means is we know that the biggest barrier or the biggest sort of concern around leadership training, particularly kind of a more traditional leadership training, which is on-site or off-site workshops or programs. So saying that leaders go off and do some kind of development somewhere for a day or 2 or hours or whatever it might look like. What happens after that, right? They come back, they go back into their workplace. They probably have to catch up on all the work that they've missed while they were in training. And basically they fall directly back into the pattern of, what they were doing before training. So that the behavioral change that we're really after is not happening because there's no time, there's pressure, there's maybe the environment is not supportive of that transfer. We also know that is actually not a worst case scenario. That's sort of a pretty normal case scenario. The worst case scenario, what can happen after the leadership training, is that some of those leaders or managers that participated in that leadership development will actually start becoming increasingly disengaged at the workplace, because they now have a kind of a really startling realization that what they have been taught in training and the reality of leadership in their organization are really different, right? So we've been taught that this is the way that leaders are or should be, and we come back and we see that, hey, everyone here is doing things completely differently. So that can be quite hard for people to sort of realize, and that leads to disengagement. And so in this one particular study, they showed that up to a third of managers then subsequently left the organization because they couldn't deal with this kind of level of kind of cognitive dissonance, essentially, if you like, around what they have been trained in and what the reality was. So at the moment, of course, when anyone mentions turnover, everyone gets a bit stiff and a bit worried. So I guess the key takeaway here is that let's make sure that we're not making the situation worse with leadership development that leads people to leaving the organizations, right? All right. All right, I see question. Yeah, all right. I'll come back to the questions a little bit later on. So what are the things that matter to the behavioral transfer? The content warning here, the list is going to be very long. So there are two categories here, as you can see on the slide. The first thing is there are kind of design characteristics or characteristics that are specific to training and the learner. So those are the things that we need to think as part of designing the training or the programs. And then there's also part to it which is more general or general environment kind of factors. And again, I warned you, the lists are quite long, so bear with me. So the things that are really specific to training that we need to think about in terms of enabling that behavioral transfer are things like how ready the people are for the training, how motivated they are to actually adopt the training. Do they perceive positive or negative personal outcomes out of adopting the training? Meaning that if I'm going to change my behavior, is there something good that's going to happen to me in the organizations? How much capacity do I have as a learner to actually modify my behavior and start doing things differently? How much peer support do I have? How much manager support do I have? Manager support is actually one of the top predictors of behavioral transfer. So that if you would address anything out of this list, the first thing I would address is managerial support. Perceived content validity, meaning how relevant and how applicable this training was actually to me and my situation. Transfer design, how easy how much do I understand about how I can change my behavior? So if the training was, for example, very theoretical and there were no examples of actual kind of application or no ways of experimenting, so role modeling on group activities with the training, then transfer design would be low, right? So it's only theory, and then what do I do with that? Yeah, it sounds really good, but what do I actually do now? And then opportunities to use learning. So how much opportunity do I actually have to engage with the learning? Again, coming back to a very long to-do list that accumulated over the 2 days that you were in the training, opportunity to use learning is probably quite low. And then we have factors that are quite generic or general, and these are kind of independent of any specific training, but more around kind of the larger organizational environment, organizational culture. And some of this comes directly from the motivational, the equity theory. So things like if I invest effort in changing my behavior, will it result in actual performance improvement for me? If I improve that performance, will it result in some form of positive outcome for me? So essentially saying, is there a point for me to even modify and try to do something differently, right? And then how resistant, open to change is the organization. So this is not about the individual, but more the organizational climate. How much performance self-efficacy do I have, meaning how much do I believe in myself and my skills and my ability to execute? And also feedback and performance. So how much feedback do I get on my behavior, and how much performance coaching do I get? So meaning that, do I have access to a mentor, a coach, a manager as a coach who will help me to figure out of how to improve my performance through the training? Right, so quite a long list. All of these things essential to ensuring that the training actually results in those behavioral changes that we all want to see. So as I said, if you were to tackle just one of those, I would definitely start with managerial support, because we know that's one of the key ones that matters for behavioral transfer. Okay, and this just a reminder. So again, I think a lot of you will be familiar with the notorious 70-20-10 framework. Been around for a while. This is what I call the renewed 70-20-10 framework, which was recently published, I think this year, both as an academic publication and also HBR piece. And basically, what it reminds us of is that really any leadership development should only consist, 10% is your structured programs and your knowledge, kind of gaining the knowledge. The 20% of that is interactions with others, so working on the identity and self-discovery, and 70% is on the job experiences, which is the opportunity to apply that training. So what's really important to remember here is that we need to moderate that on the job experience, right? We can't just sort of leave it to people to, yeah, you go, here's the training, and then you go back and do whatever you want with it, or, figure it out on your own. We need to actually design for on the job experience and behavioral transfer. So we need to integrate things into that job design, or those on the job experiences that will help our learners to actually continue to grow and learn and practice and ultimately change their behaviors, right? So a simple example, some kind of nudging or reinforcement strategy, right, of learning. So behavioral science inspired nudging, if you haven't heard of it, it's basically, little triggers around, achieving the change in behaviors, right? So can be very, very simple, can be, things like, some of us do, which is printing something out as a reminder, like a quote or some kind of framework or a model, print it out, put it somewhere next to your desk as a constant reminder to sort of practice the behavior differently, or approach behavior differently, or sending emails to the learners, right? So consistently weekly or fortnightly reminders around kind of little tips and tricks. Why don't you try this week to do something differently, experiment with the part of the learning that you had in that workshop, right? So how about this week you try to approach a conversation with your employee differently, and try to be more compassionate, and here are the 5 things that you can do, or 5 is probably too many, 3 things that you can do to practice being compassionate, right? So just kind of an example of what that looks like. So don't leave the don't leave the transfer to them to figure out. Make sure that you stay with it and keep working on those skills together with the learners. All right. And then the last part, just being mindful of time. This one is a question actually for you. I was curious just to kind of re-engage who's been listening for me for a bit too long. If you could pop in the chat, just quickly, do you think that leadership development should be mandatory or voluntary? So what would you kind of think? Like, should we? Okay, with some stepping in, so voluntary. Trevor thinks it should be voluntary. Okay, what do others think? Just type in the chat. Mandatory. Okay. Yep, someone likes the voluntary. Mandatory. Yep. Mandatory. Okay. Yep. Seeing it depends on the level of the leader. Yep, very good. Thanks, Isabella. Very, very. It depends is the organizational psychologist's favorite answer to everything, isn't it? Yeah. Part of role requirements, so mandatory. Yep. Excellent. Hybrid, Lorraine, also organizational psychologist. So it depends, of course, like our favorite answer to everything. Mandatory for new leaders. Yep. Excellent. Okay, very good. Thanks very much for that. So the answer, unfortunately, I already made a joke about this, is it depends. We have some research, some meta-analytical research that actually suggests that the either way is beneficial, but sort of for different things. So voluntary training is best for learning. When I am there, and that makes sense, right? When I'm there on my own accord and I'm motivated to be there, I actually learn better because I'm more kind of open to the learning. But mandatory training, and this was a little bit surprising, mandatory attendance at leadership training specifically has been shown to be better for behavioral change, or that behavioral transfer, which we just talked about. And we're not quite fully sure about why that is the case, but it might be something to do with the fact that, if my employer is kind of demanding me or, making it mandatory for me to attend the training, it might be that people then go, well, it must be important, so I have to try to then actually implement, right? So there's that kind of power, feel around the power of, being in that training and being required to be in that training. My take on it is that we need to think about a couple of things here, but two things. So from one end, we know that one-size-fits-all approach to leadership development is no longer sufficient. We can't rely on it anymore. So that would be the type of like mandatory, everyone goes through the same program. There has to be a level of personalization, as the key number 3 suggests, personalized design. On the other hand, we also need everyone in our organizations to have at least a sort of a basic level of leadership skill set. And, because if we are to address issues like what I mentioned in the beginning, where we have the problem with succession planning and high potentials, because there's such a huge turnover, we don't know who is actually going to be around. We don't know who is going to be ready to step in or step up. We need everyone to kind of be ready to step up to an extent, right? So I see it as that more of a, hybrid approach, where there is a level of kind of basic mandatory leadership training that most employees, or ideally every employee, has access to. And then on top of that, we then start building those personalized experiences depending on the level, on the learner needs, on the level in the organization, whatever it might be. So some things around to think about here of what it might be is, one, we know that identity, leader beliefs, and those are very personal, very individualized, have a lot to do with the effectiveness of the training. So in our research, we have shown that, for example, individuals only engage in training if they believe they are a leader and to what extent they are a leader. and they only engage with the content that aligns with their beliefs around leadership. So if I believe that leadership is being, whatever it might be, then I'm more receptive to the training, the content in the training that actually directly kind of aligns with those beliefs. And hence thinking about what those beliefs might be and how can we kind of work with an individual to maybe change those beliefs or reinforce, depending on what they are, right? Then gives us ideas around how we need to approach this more personalized, individualized kind of training. And we also know that training has to shift identity to change the behavior. So that comes back to our behavioral transfer, right? So I need to see myself differently after the training in order for my behavior to actually change and that change to be sustainable. And the other thing, which also I know this is this is definitely growing and trending, and definitely is going to become something that hopefully a lot more people talk about in the next, probably not even 2023, but 2025, because it takes a while for these ideas to spread. But we see a lot of conversations around adult development as a context for leadership development at the moment. I myself am a huge fan of adult development theories and how they can really help us to understand how leaders develop and what we need to do to help them develop. So keeping in mind, I won't spend too much time on this. You can look it up. I'll be sending the slides with some resources if you're really interested. I also had a different event where I just very briefly also discussed adult development and what it means. So you might want to check that one out. I'll be sending the links out. But we need to remember here, what I want you to remember is that estimated about 60% of all of our leaders still operate from the socialized mind stage, which is this one down here, right? And what it means that at this stage, leaders are increasingly and almost fully concerned, transfixed on themselves, on who they are as individuals, how they are seen by other people, and their primary concern and issue that they try to avoid is conflict, and that means that they avoid conflict pretty much by all means, which means that they avoid making hard decisions. They seek consensus on almost everything that they try to do, which can be highly unproductive. And they really are much better followers at that stage than they are leaders. So as a larger conversation in leadership development, what we really need to be thinking about is how do we not only train our leaders in whatever that is skills or competencies that we need to train them in, but how do we also design the training in a way that's going to help them to grow as adults? Because ultimately we really want more of our leaders globally, everywhere, corporates, not-for-profits, government, you pick your battlefield. We need more leaders to really advance and transition into the stage 4, which is the self-altering mind, right? And I think like that has to really underpin everything that we do in this sort of more broader leadership development context, right? So that's something else to another thing to throw at you, right? Okay, so very briefly going to share a case study with you, and then we'll have 10 more minutes for questions and answers. So this is the program that I have done a while ago here in WA. It was a larger kind of corporate program for high potentials for executives, mid to high executive level leaders, very selective, very, this design inspired by these ideas of, high potentials are only 5% of employees, which we really don't subscribe to anymore, or we shouldn't. But, unfortunately, and back in the day, and still a lot of organizations subscribe to these view, hoping to change that. But nevertheless, we had about 80 participants in 5 years, so only small cohorts going through every year, 4 months of quite intensive kind of integrative training. all focused on these distinct leadership competencies, which you can see on the right-hand side here. The competencies selected by an organization as their leadership competencies. These are the competencies that we think our leaders should have. Our role was to an extent, design the training, not deliver, to avoid any kind of conflict of interest, and also evaluate. So some of the evaluation questions we asked were, how do these leadership competencies develop? What is the role of leader identity? As I've spoken to you about identity and how it's important in training, and what are the outcomes? What are the results? Does this change anything for the person? So we actually focused on promotion. So do the leaders get promoted in? I think we have data corridor of about 7 years, so up to sort of 2 years after taking part in the program. So some of the findings, and by the way, this paper is published, so if you're really interested, it's open access, it's on Frontiers. You can have a look, have a read over it, discuss everything in detail around what we did and how. So we do find that all 8 competencies develop over that training period, which remind you 4 months. But the rate of change was highly variable between the individuals. So not surprisingly, but also the first real sort of validation of this idea that people do develop different rates and different trajectories, even if they go through, almost exactly the same training program. So kind of talking to the point I made earlier about necessity to really personalize that, training. And leader identity also helps to accelerate the development of some competencies, which again, back to this idea that the beliefs that I have about myself and my leadership are really going to moderate or influence, what I take from that training and how much of that I actually take back into the workplace with me. And then the promotion, this was the most interesting bit for us, and also usually is the most interesting for people whom I share this study with. So we looked at how the advancement or the positive trend in the competencies influences the odds, what we call odds of promotion, so chances of promotion. And we found that basically out of the 8 competencies that we looked at, only 3 had an impact on chances of being promoted. And only one of those is positively related, which is the bottom one here, the managing stress. So leaders who became better in managing their stress had slightly higher chances of being promoted. And this was the red bar, value and diversity bar here is the most surprising, not surprising, but surprising finding that we had is that leaders who actually became better in valuing diversity, advancing diversity for their organization had much higher, much lower, significantly lower chances of being promoted, which suggests to us that, goes all the way back to the very first slide that I showed you was the why. The first step in everything that we do should be the why. Thanks, Simon Sinek. But particularly in the context of leadership development, if the organization designates valuing diversity as one of their core competencies that they want their leaders to advance in, then clearly there's a misalignment between that sort of designation of core competency and their larger, broader organizational climate, which is what we find here, that the people who are actually better are not the ones who then get opportunities for advancement and promotion. And I'll leave it at that because I've taken most of our hour. I want to see if, let me just jump back in the room here. I'll stop sharing. Basically, yes, any questions or comments, let me have a look at the chat, and then we can see what okay. So, Carrie, can you share the link to the meta-analysis? Meta-analysis on, sorry, just for Because there's a
Got
few.
my notes. There was the one that you mentioned about. Where did I find it? Oh, if you want to go ahead with the questions, and I'll find it and I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. Mark asked a while ago, in the current hybrid working environment, what would you recommend around team mentoring and shared learning experience, learning from osmosis? As in, Mark, are you still around?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Yeah, so the question is more around the hustle, right? So, you know, in the office environment, you get the opportunity to follow, observe, learn by osmosis, drive mentorship. And the 70-20-10 rule is very applicable, but it's a lot harder to do that 20% in a hybrid environment. So I was just kind of keen to understand what strategies you've seen or used in that space that tends to work.
Yeah, no, the absolutely. I think that you're spot on, in hybrid environment does, moderate a lot of these things and makes a huge difference. I think it is much harder to achieve a lot of these sort of learning outcomes in the hybrid training, but at the same time, that's becoming the reality, right? Like that's becoming the norm of a lot of these training initiatives. So look, I think the the core tenet of experiential learning, sure, observation to an extent, but also sharing of those experiences um still important. So to say that you can't necessarily observe someone that well in the online environment, but you can still share kind of the experiences and interpretation around those experiences in a kind of a discussion form, if that makes sense. So anything from, I think anything from the like critical learning or critical incident methodology could work quite well if we only have kind of online environment, right? So sharing, okay, what happened, what did we do, and how do we unpack that? So that sort of
It shifts it from an ad hoc mode to a very intentional, deliberate knowledge sharing mode, which is not, which sometimes can be a little bit harder, particularly where you've got emerging leaders and experienced leaders, and creating those formal touch points in those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Look, there's, after event reviews, I always say after event reviews, particularly, I've really underutilized, in leadership development as well, right? So, and that has been said already 10 years ago, and we're still not really using that for, only in coaching, right? Where you kind of go on, this happened and this is what I do, and the coach will go, oh, but like, why not also in that team context, so why not utilize the same methodology? And that becomes great way of learning. So you could like, something that came to mind, like typically, leadership programs, right, start with, someone fairly senior comes on and kind of talks about, a bit of like introduction and kind of giving weight to the program, right? I would use that as an opportunity to actually share a real learning experiences rather than the kind of fairly, generic, like la la la, and this is what organization is about and this is why it's important. Why not come and bring that, that senior leader in the room, and it can be an online room, and say, can you share with us an actual stories from your kind of, leadership experiences that align with the content, so today we're going to be talking about whatever, can you give us a story where and that gives and then emerging leaders are all going to be all ears because it's someone senior, and then you can use that same story to unpack it later on in the workshop, for example. Yeah, I think someone else had something to say. Diana said, we're completely remote and we have a mentoring program that is available all year round, in 3 people involved as mentor or mentee at the moment. Our ERG groups like women representing groups and great learning spaces too. Yeah, so mentoring would be another vessel. But again, your question was more on team learning, right? So mentoring, then the team sort of mentoring or team action learning sets, right? The fancy new name for debriefs. Or yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Okay, Kathy, yeah, the research to that meta-analysis will be in the references. Actually, have the full slide with references in the end of the presentation, as usual. So, Melanie, storytelling is very powerful. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mel. A lot of, yeah, storytelling. Yeah, learning that bit myself as well. Any other, we just have 1 minute. Anyone else with any burning questions or burning comments? Just remember, I will be sending all the resources out once they're ready. So the full pack with the recording, also for those who weren't able to attend. Remember that you have the offer for the leadership audit sessions with myself for free. Only thing you need to do if you want one of those, just send me an email saying I want one of those sessions. There's a limited number available, and the preference is for people who are actually in attendance here today, rather than everyone who registered and didn't make it. So if you do want one, just email me and we'll find a suitable time this year or maybe next year now to do that and kind of delve deeper into all of this, but like in the context of your specific organization, which can be really, really valuable and insightful. And other than that, thank you so much for coming in here today. And I hope that everyone takes at least something out of this and has some insight, and here's to the better leadership development for all of us in all of our organizations. And hoping to, maybe we'll do another one in the end of 2023 and see, where we're at that stage. But thank you so much for being here today. And I will stay on for a little bit if anyone wants to chat about anything else. Thanks.
Thanks, Darja.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.